Hi, everybody. I'd love to introduce Cade Coldren from Texas Tech University, who's been working on general ecosystem modeling at large scale using EDYS. So welcome, Cade.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate that. And I appreciate everybody who is on for giving me your time this morning. As Greg said, I'd like to talk about the ecological modeling I've been doing at Tech. There are a number of models that are being used here at Tech in the different departments like natural resource management, plant and soil science, civil engineering, but they're all very specialized. So things like crop models under different conditions, animal population dynamics, animal movements, soil moisture, hydrologic models, but there's only one real general ecosystem model called EDYS. And this is the one that I've been involved with now for 27 years that I'd like to talk to you about. I'd like to start with a little bit of history of the model because it will help inform some of the decisions we made on the design processes. And then I'd like to go through some validation studies and then give you some ideas of some of the types of projects that we've conducted over the years. So the history, actually, EDYS got its start back in the late 1980s. There was a PhD plant ecologist who was actually teaching a high school biology class at a private high school in South Texas. And what he had his students do was simple plant growth models. And he used that as a way to teach them both ecology and coding. And obviously, in the 1980s, it was on some of the earliest PCs that were available. It was running DOS. It was coded in Fortran. I'm sure a few of y'all remember those days. He eventually then moved to Colorado State, and he brought in a postdoc in 1992 who'd done his PhD work using Turbo Pascal. He converted everything from the Fortran over. And then I joined the team in 98 after I finished my PhD. I have a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, 5 years in software design and maintenance. But in that process, I fell in love with birds and went back, got my master's and PhD in wildlife and fisheries. And so I was brought in to bring in animal code into the model. So initially, our primary goal for EDYS was to be able to handle large-scale dynamics like you see in this photo in the top, which is an area north of San Antonio. And the large-scale processes that operate on that ecosystem, like fire, drought, climate change, for example, but also to be able to handle the small-scale dynamics. So you see that little bitty juniper down in the middle of that opening. What happens to it as it grows and ultimately shades out some of the trees around it, and how it is infected or affected by the large-scale dynamics and how it can ultimately play a role in the large-scale dynamics itself. So bringing in all of those different spatial levels. And at the time, we thought, if we can get a model that will work in grasslands and savannas and forests, we'll be good to go. And we identified our desired end users as being land managers, field biologists, restoration ecologists, environmental planning and compliance teams with different agencies. But if you've ever had any exposure to those types of people, you know they're underfunded, they tend to live in more rural areas, and they don't have access to a whole lot of high-end computing power. But what they do have are PCs sitting on their desk in their office. And so what we wanted was to make sure that we could reach those end users, run EDYS on a Windows-based PC. And at the time, there weren't that many Apple computers out there. And so that was our desired platform, was Windows. If you look at different types of ecological models, broad classes that I teach my modeling students here, there's really three: statistical, empirical, there's state transition, and then there's mechanistic. But what we wanted was a model that we could easily transport across different ecosystem types. And for us, that ruled out using statistical or empirical type approaches. Those things might work very well for one ecosystem type, but it becomes difficult or impossible even to extrapolate to other types. So you can't necessarily develop a model for a grassland and expect it to be used in a forest if it's a statistical / empirical. State transition has all kinds of problems and assumptions. We had no desire to go that route, and we felt like mechanistic was the only real way that we could achieve our goals. And so we started with simply a list of ecological processes. And since the model began around plant dynamics, then the first ones we came up were such as these, like, how does a plant break dormancy? In other words, how does it green out in the spring? How does a seed germinate? How does a plant take up water? How much new growth can a plant have based on their water uptake? And what effect does nitrogen and other nutrients, and honestly contaminants as well, have on that growth? How does a plant lose tissue when it enters dormancy or dies back in the fall? How is tissue lost to herbivory? And a whole slew of other plant growth ones. We also realized that if we're going to do plant growth well, we got to get the soil hydrology modeled well also, which includes dealing properly with rainfall, interception, evaporation, infiltration, percolation, recharge, runoff. And then once those pieces were working, then we brought in a number of others, like adding spatial heterogeneity, erosion and deposition, herbivory, groundwater effects, competition for light, space, and nutrients, and of course, contaminants, fire, whether it's natural fire or prescribed. All types of different animal dynamics that I'm not even going to go into today. And then a whole slew of management activities and stressors, both natural and anthropogenic. And so what we did was, after identifying those processes, we went into the literature to try to find out how each of those work. In some cases, we were able to get algorithms that we could use, but in most cases, the descriptions of these processes are more qualitative. But what we could get from the literature were the steps involved in how those processes operate. We're also able to get ideas of what we needed as inputs and what to expect coming out. Forcing functions. What processes drive what inputs drive those processes? And typically when you're working with plants, that's going to be water, right? Rainfall. And then what parameters do we need? And so we ended up with a set of core algorithms for each ecological process. And the nice thing about it is they can be applied to any ecosystem type. Grasses take up water just like trees do. The amounts they take up and where they get that water from the soil may differ, but they still do it the same way. And so when you get into it and start looking, essentially plants work the same. There are a few exceptions. Wetland plants, some succulents and epiphytes deal with things a little differently than most plants, but for the most part, plants work the same. And I'll give you an example later in this presentation on where that came into play in one particular project. And so now you can view EDYS and what we have in place like an onion, if you will. So the innermost layer are those core algorithms. Outside of that are the parameters that we put in. Plant species lists, soil characteristics, all the plant growth parameters. And outside of that is the spatial heterogeneity, the plant community's topography, elevation, slope, aspect, distributions of the soils. And then all of our management activities and different types of stressors. And then last, the ones that drive it all are the forcing functions. And for EDYS, since we're talking about plants, those are precip, both rain and snow, but also groundwater. And so now, 27 years on for me, the systems, the ecosystems that we have simulated using the same core algorithms, just changing the inputs, range from the grasslands, savannas, and forests, and not just temperate forest, but also rainforest. We have an application where we've got more than 3 meters of rainfall annually. Deserts, marshes, both freshwater and saltwater, and tundra. And that one actually involved the most code changes in order to bring in permafrost. Temporal aspects for EDYS, we had to decide on the basic time step. And when you start thinking about plant dynamics, that had to be daily. Plants take up most of their water during the day, only just a little bit at night, but their growth only occurs during the day when they're photosynthetically active. And so the daily time step was the obvious choice. Now, we did ultimately link EDYS with a base circulation model on the Texas coast, and we had to take that time step down to hourly in order to accommodate tidal and salinity differences in those salt marshes. And then the length of the simulation run, obviously it depends on the project objectives. We've done some as short as 1 year. The longest we've ever done is 250 years, where we were tasked with simulating the establishment of a mature Doug-fir forest from bare ground conditions. And then there's spatial aspects. So we have a grid that we apply where we handle all of our spatial heterogeneity. And decisions have to be made on different, for each project, on what that, what the resolution of that grid is, the cell size. And so the way we approach it is that size of the cell is the largest in which you can accept average conditions, meaning everything in that cell is going to be uniform. But it also has to be small enough to capture heterogeneity that we need in a lot of our applications. We've gone as small as 1 square centimeter when our entire simulation was one individual big sagebrush plant. And we've gone all the way up to a cell size of 250 acres when we're simulating large watersheds. And then the other spatial aspect is the domain. What is the spatial extent of the area that we are simulating? For the big sagebrush plant, that was a 1 square meter. Typically nowadays, we do entire watersheds. And the reason we do that is if you take a portion out of a watershed, then unless it's at the headwaters, you're going to have some water running on to your model domain. And if you don't know the volume of that water and what it contains in terms of contaminants, nutrients, or sediments, then the expectation is your results are not going to be as accurate. So we've learned to do entire watersheds or subwatersheds where we don't have to worry about how much is running on. And then if we need to, we can pull out that smaller area of interest for more accurate simulations because we know what's running on. Typically, we use a GIS to overlay different layers, maps of plant communities, soils, elevations, and whatever else is important for the application. For some of our military bases, we've also had layers of training areas that we would overlay on this as well. And what we call a community in EDYS is a unique combination of plants, soils, and probably elevation, slope, or aspect. Not in all cases, but generally so. And this photo shows one of our applications in the San Antonio River watershed, where you can see the different types of vegetation we're dealing with, from pastures, more savanna areas, to some forested areas. The red polygons are different soil profiles. And so we'll take those, overlay them to come up with unique combinations. And that's the basic unit that we then simulate in the model. As far as the plant communities are concerned, how many species we bring in is flexible. Generally, or almost always, we bring in whatever the dominant species are. Typically, we will bring in anything that's ecologically important. If there's something that's threatened and endangered, or a rare species of concern, we will bring it in. And often we'll bring in plants that are important for human society. And I'll show you a couple of those in a moment. But the problem that we have is, as the more plant species we add, yes, there's potential increases in ecological realism, but it also has costs in terms of runtimes and interpretation time. So if you're trying to look at the outputs from the model and you're only having to look at 10 species as opposed to 50, it's a lot easier dealing with 10 versus 50. So that's what I mean by interpretation time. The flip side to that is, a lot of plant species we don't have, there's not research that exists on many of the growth parameters that we need. And so if we bring some of those in where we have to make educated guesses as to the parameters, we're introducing noise into the system. And the question becomes, how much of that noise can we accept? So what we often do is use what we call surrogate species. So they're a combination of several that are very similar. They may be similar in terms of relatedness, like they're all from the same genus, or they may be similar ecologically, or both. So for example, applications we did in that San Antonio River watershed, where we had 66 species total, and a breakdown: trees, shrubs, midgrasses, short grasses, grasslipes, forbs, cultivated. Here's those three of human interest: the grain, sorghum, wheat, and corn. But that's the total number of species. Any community will only have a subset of these.
Question now.
Yes.
How do you trade this off? Because a lot of, like, you've been going through all the details of how you account for different stuff, but past a certain point, there is this diminishing returns on both accuracy and the data availability. So the more details you add, the more accurate the model is, up to lack of data. How do you know when you've hit that?
Well, generally, we have a pretty good idea when we go into the literature and we can't find data on a species. And typically what will happen is we'll make up a list and we'll go in and see what we can find, and there'll be half to a third of them and there's just no data. And so at that point, we stop where we actually have data. Does that make sense?
It does. Now, for individual species, it's easy to quantify, but as you add number of species, interactions become relevant. So it's quadratically many as you keep growing. How is this even feasible, or are there ways of proxying interactions through other means?
So I agree that there are interactions, but that's where those mechanisms come into play. How do the different species compete for resources?
Right.
we've never encountered a situation where we thought we've reached a limit. And maybe I'm not understanding your question well enough.
Well, let me give you an example. So if you have like
Yeah.
a vine species that chokes another species, that's a very unique interspecies interaction. And there's generic ones like crown competition. They just shove each other to the side. It doesn't matter who's shoving. They can both be reduced. Shoving can be reduced into a pretty small, simple dynamic. I don't know, in the case of plants, what dominates, the pairwise interactions that are unique, or there's a bunch of like shoving or crown competition, like competition, that's pretty generic. Doesn't really matter what the species is.
All of that can come into play.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you think about not just species, but you also have vertical structure.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the shading or the not shading, but there's also competition, different root architectures below the surface that are competing for resources as well. And what we've learned is simply coding those processes allows that competition so we can see what happens realistically. And what's interesting about it is there have been a couple of times where we've been looking at those interspecies dynamics, and what comes out of the model is not what we expected. And so I was generally tasked with, okay, Cade, go find the bug.
Yeah.
And after a couple of days, I come back and say, look, the code is working the way it's supposed to. And then you go back into the literature and you realize our expectations, our preconceived notions were not complete enough.
Right. Okay. No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Sure, sure. Okay, so where I was I was going to go down briefly a list of the types of plant parameters that we look at. We got 37 different matrices that cover growth through different times of the year, right? Green out, regular season growth, and seed production are all different. There's different levels of photosynthetic tissue versus carbohydrate reserves. Roots, there's different architectures. There's competition below ground between species. Phenology, when does a species break dormancy? When does it set seed? When does it go dormant again or die back? Germination, water use. How much water does it take to produce above ground biomass? How much nutrients do different species need and how do they use those? What happens to dormancy? Light competition and shading, tolerances for salinity and flooding, fuel load. You would generally think of that as just being plant biomass, but some species have volatile compounds, and those species tend to contribute that amount of biomass burns hotter, so it's in essence a greater fuel load. And of course, then there's herbivory. So a couple of diagrams on how we have the model structured. What we call a plot is that unique combination of plants and soils. And I have it listed here as 1 by 1 meter. It doesn't have to be that size. But then there's variations of that make up a community. So same plant species, but different biomasses for different ones. So like, for example, that little circular area down in the lower right with the black center, that could be a depression. And so what you have is a little bit more water there, and those plants would have a slightly higher biomass than the same plants adjacent where it doesn't have that extra moisture. And then, of course, then the plant species, the communities are aggregated into whatever the landscape is. And then here's the basic plot structure. And this is a complicated diagram, but it's an oversimplification of what we have in the model. So you'll notice in the middle, we've got a soil surface. Below that are different soil layers. I've got 4 illustrated. We typically go to 35. in order to capture those dynamics more appropriately. There's water, organic matter, nitrogen, contaminants, and all of that can be taken up by the roots. And every plant species has a different root architecture. Above ground, we've got the different plant parts broken out, trunks, stems, leaves. We also have seeds. And the reason this matters is because herbivores graze differently. So like a cow, she'll take that old tongue and wrap around the grass and pull the whole thing out. She gets everything above ground and a large chunk of below ground. But a deer will go up and nibble leaves. So it's a completely different effect, but that's captured. And all of this, keep in mind, is changing on a daily basis. And then hydrology on the plot level. We have rainfall coming in, some loss due to interception, some hits the soil surface, runs off, some infiltrates, evaporates, can be taken up by the plants. And then at the bottom, I have it listed as export. Most people consider that recharge, but we don't model geology below the rooting zone. So we don't really know where that water goes. So we just call it export.
So question.
Yes.
Actually, these pictures you had before, they look a lot like what DSAT, AppSim for agricultural crops, or I mean, similar models have, describing kind of the subsoil hydrology, the layers, the depth of the roots, same thing for above ground biomass, except I think you're focusing more on perennials, obviously, because it's more like forests. But then how does the resolution of EDYS compare to the resolution of these, let's say, crop models or forest models, the dedicated ones?
I don't have any experience with dedicated forest models. In my experience, they tend to be more GIS based, but my experience is a little limited. The crop models tend to be much broader in scale. So it's often, at least the one that I'm familiar with that they use here, it's on an acreage basis. So you have an entire area that is planted, and unless they specifically go in and break out parts that they know have maybe different soil characteristics or are a little different topographically, they treat them all the same. And so those crop models tend to be more coarse than what we are able to do in EDYS, since we can take it down to very fine scales.
In terms of plant phenology, because when I hear those, they talk about the budding phenomenon. I mean, like when you have the plant, you have like the buds for the leaves, and you have the individual leaves coming out. They have those kinds of stages for a plant. Do you have the same kind of evolution dynamics?
Yes.
Okay. So then I'm actually now trying to think of agroforestry, these more complex dynamics where you have multiple different crop types, annual, perennial interacting. So I just trying to relate how EDYS relates to kind of the other tools that are available and when you would use EDYS as opposed to those.
Think of EDYS as the native ecosystems. I mean, we can do crops, but our strength are the natives.
Okay, that makes sense. Incorporating hydrology and like you're saying, saltwater marshes, that kind of stuff.
Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so at this point, we've applied EDYS to 48 different locations, mostly in Western North America, but also Australia and Indonesia. We've done validation studies with the Corps of Engineers, USGS, NRCS, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, CERTUP, CSIRO, over 60 papers and technical reports. And as far as I know, 26 scientific meetings. We've also used it for environmental compliance. So the Air Force Academy in Colorado was looking to increase cadet training in one area, and they had to have NEPA compliance, and they came to us and was able to get it past the NEPA process. A mine site in Montana, we used it to get compliance through Montana DEQ so that they could establish their closure plan and walk away. And here's a long list. I'm not going to read all these to you of different things that we have done. Covers the gamut pretty much. T&E species, vegetation dynamics in response to all types of different things: military training, drought, climate change, fire, herbivory. We're even now, the very bottom one, we started a project where we're looking at application of treated produced water from oil and gas wells into native rangeland to see if we can affect some restoration. So a whole slew of different uses. And here's a list of all the management activities and stressors that we've done. The very bottom, the military training, we were asked to set up a model for an area in Fort Bliss in southern New Mexico. And they actually rent part of their reservation out to the German Air Force. And so all of these, particularly the bombing with movable targets, we had to put in, it's almost like a video game approach to ecology. So what I'd like to do is go through one project real quick that kind of shows you the value of a mechanistic approach to modeling. So that Fort Bliss, most of the reservation is in southern New Mexico, and the BLM, it's actually BLM land that the Army leases. And that high desert grassland dominated by black grama has been in decline. And the BLM claimed that the Army was putting too many tanks out there. And the Army claimed that the BLM was running too many cattle. So they brought us in to look at it. And so we set it up. And so let me explain what you're looking at here. So this is end of season above ground biomass at 10-year intervals, 10, 20, 30, and 40. Each of the colors represents a different plant species. So the blue and the green are the shrubs, and everything else are grasses and forbs. Let's see. So this no LT and HV are levels of cattle grazing. No grazing, light, and heavy. And you'll notice a decline through 30 years. That's due to drought. It broke in year 37, and hence the increase in biomass at year 40. But what's interesting is this has fire at 7-year intervals. You take fire out, that's the only difference between these two. You take fire out, and year 36, under heavy cattle grazing, that system collapsed. And it transitioned from a predominantly grassland to a shrubland with very little grass. And if you've ever had any exposure on trying to restore a grassland from something that has been taken over by woodies, it's very expensive and very time consuming. So the key here was not too many cattle and not too many tanks, but fire suppression. So a little bit on the validation studies that we've conducted to give you an idea of how well the model actually handles. So there's that, once again, that black grama grassland at Fort Bliss. We set up 48 sample plots had site-specific rainfall. We sampled at the beginning of year 1 and again at the end of year 2. We used that first sample as our initial conditions. We projected blindly for 2 years and then compared the model outputs with the sample data. Almost without exception, there's no statistically significant difference between the model projections and the sample data. Pretty good about that. This was our first time. We went into it nervous, not knowing what to expect, but we're pleased. We then did a 4-year projection with 64 sample plots, looking at cheatgrass and a knapweed species that for the life of me, I can't remember which exact species it is. Look across, once again, no statistically significant differences between the EDYS projections and the sample data. And here's an interesting one. We have done some work in Owens Valley, California for LA Department of Water and Power. And one of the areas, a parcel of land that they owned, they had 17 years worth of sample data. And they asked us to set it up and see what it looked like, just to see how well EDYS would do with their data. And this is what it came up with. And the folks in Bishop loved it. I looked at it and thought, oh, that's crap compared to what we've done before. And so I started digging and I found these 2 photos. The one on the left in particular, this is that parcel. And that photo was taken in winter. And you notice there's several dark things near the camera, close to the observer. Those are cow pies. We were told there was no cattle grazing on that parcel. And as it turns out, the guy that had the lease would run cattle for a little bit until he found out when the LA folks were going to be out to sample, and then he'd remove them so they couldn't see the evidence. But what happened was, after he would remove them, you get this flush of leaves off the vegetation. And that's what we were not able to capture because we didn't know there was cattle grazing out there.
So this is extra nitrogen coming into the system because of the cattle?
Say that again?
Like extra nitrogen fertilizer coming into the system because of cattle, or is it the grazing that takes material away?
It's the grazing that takes the material away. Yes. But what you get is once you take them off, you get this big flush of new leaves. And the measurement that they had was for cover. And so when you go out to measure cover, all those new leaves get counted, and hence those sample plots, like in 91, 93, 97, you get those huge increases that we couldn't capture appropriately in the model because we didn't know there were cattle out there.
So then that's a good question about, you would, suppose you even knew there was cattle. How much? Is there, what resolution of let's say, cattle measurements would be required to make a usable like prediction?
Stocking rate.
What does that mean? Like how many, or?
How many head per acre?
I see.
In essence, that's really all you need.
Yeah. Then there's like an average amount of consumption for a given cow, right?
Exactly.
Got it. Okay.
Yep. We also did a validation study looking at evapotranspiration rates. This is paired subwatersheds north of San Antonio, where the USGS set up some gauging stations. This is across a 4-year study. Once again, no statistically significant differences. Here's an interesting one where we were looking at treating woody vegetation to aid in aquifer recharge. And so what this graph shows is that export or recharge, if you will, of the treated runs over what it would be if they hadn't been treated. So anything, the higher you go, the greater the impact of the treatment on recharge. And so looking at the graph, you can go, well, you know, about year 5, you need to retreat because things have leveled off and the effect of the initial treatment is pretty much gone. You go to the literature, one study says 5 years, another says 3 to 5. Not bad. So let me go now talk about a couple of the projects that we've done. But I also have to tell you there are some limitations on what I can tell you. There are several projects where proprietary information was involved, and I can't say just a whole lot from those. And y'all have proprietary information too. I know my daughter works for Google, and she won't tell me some of the things that goes on, so y'all should understand what I'm talking about. Also, EDYS has been used in litigation. And it's not that we've been sued or that we've sued anybody. It's that there were 2 parties that were in dispute. And the court brought us in to resolve the ecological issues. So maybe we could reach a settlement. And to my knowledge, that settlement has been reached, but I don't know the specifics. So I'm not sure I really should say a whole lot. And then the last one, there was a project that is classified. I worked on it when I was at the Corps of Engineers. I had to get secret clearance just to work on it. And so I can't say anything more beyond that. So the first one, the Cibolo Creek is just north of San Antonio. And one of the issues they had was increasing urbanization from the city. There were a couple of towns in the watershed that were bedroom communities, but it also sits on top of 2 aquifers that are the primary source of water for San Antonio. They also were having issues with flood control and recharge. The photo on the left is kind of an average, kind of what it looks like on the flatlands in the watershed, but it's also a highly fractured limestone system. And so you have these karst features shown on that right, where you have surface runoff hits that, and it's a straight, almost like a pipeline to one of the aquifers. So it changes the way things work in terms of recharge and what can be done in the watershed. So one of the things we looked at was, what is the effect of urbanization on recharge and runoff? So we did 50-year simulations. We included zero growth, which is obviously unrealistic, but just as a baseline situation. The 3% growth, the smaller community is experiencing that. The larger one is experiencing 4% growth annually. And not a surprise, both in terms of runoff and karst recharge, you have higher levels under the higher increasing urbanization rates, right? More concrete, more buildings. But what's interesting about this is that 4% growth model died in year 43 of the 50-year simulation, simply because the entire watershed had been paved. That's something that most planners don't really think about, is what's the longer term impact, and what are we doing now if we project it outward? What are things going to look like? Here's an idea of what it could look like. Obviously, it would never go to the point of all being paved, but that is a possible outcome. We also looked at where people were putting their houses. So that is in the Texas Hill Country, which has a bunch of small and large canyons. And the desired place to build your house is at the top, where you got the really nice views. That's where the folks with the money would build. The poor folks like me would have to be restricted to building down in the bottom of the larger canyons. But what's interesting is the runoff and the karst recharge were higher when you built on the top of the canyons rather than in the bottom. And I think what's happening is you get that runoff off the concrete and the buildings, and you get enough volume that hits the slope that it doesn't slow down enough to have the opportunity to infiltrate, and hence the higher runoff and karst recharge.
What
Yeah.
are the research charges like runoff versus a profile versus karst?
So the profile is water that infiltrates and just percolates down naturally. The karst is that runoff water on the surface that hits one of those karst features and immediately hits the aquifer.
Karst feature would be like a slab of rock that just like skates over. Oh, that's a karst. Okay, I got it.
Yeah, that little opening there. Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. We've looked at the effect of military training on a number of different wildlife species in terms of habitat quality, the spatial extent of that habitat, and then food availability. So the Air Force Academy, they were looking to increase cadet training. So we had to look at elk, peregrine falcons, which were on the endangered species list at the time, Mexican spotted owl, and a small jumping mouse that only occurs along the front range of Colorado and Wyoming that is on the threatened list. At Fort Hood in central Texas, the endangered golden-cheeked warbler and the endangered black-capped vireo. And then we also did an application looking at food for desert tortoise out at 29 Palms Marine Corps Base in Southern California. A recent application of EDYS is based off of remote sensing data. Increasingly, agencies and companies are using remote sensing data, whether it's drones or fixed-wing aircraft or satellite, in order to get some higher level classifications used for land use, land cover mapping, determining vegetation condition. But I contend when you need more detailed vegetative information, they have shortcomings. There's nothing beats an expert on the ground to tell you what is actually there. The question was, how much uncertainty are these classification systems introducing into a modeling effort? So I had a grad student that just recently finished her PhD, and she was working. This map on the right here is a series of salt marshes on the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, where the endangered whooping crane winters. And what she did was she took one set of aerial photos and used four different classification techniques: supervised, unsupervised, convoluted neural network, and an object-based approach. And then looked at the sensitivity of hydrologic outputs from the model to the four different classification techniques. And as you'd expect, no single technique excelled across all aspects of hydrology. You know, if you were a land manager and your big issue was runoff, one of those four works better than the rest. But if you were concerned more about aquifer recharge, one of those four works better than the rest, and it's not the same as the one for runoff. So you have to be careful in terms of which technique you would use for the type of work you're doing. That's what her research is demonstrating. A couple of other simple things. We did a tailings pile cover design in Indonesia. And I simply mention this because if you look at the photo on the far right, you'll notice there's some yellow areas as opposed to green. As it turns out, they had monkeys coming from off the photo to graze on the newly growing succulent plants on the cover design. And so we had to bring monkeys into the model. A gold mine in Montana, just outside the north gate to Yellowstone National Park. And we used a model to determine which type of cover design would be the most effective in terms of depth, different soil characteristics, and the seed mix on top, in order to minimize the mobilization of toxic elements from the tailings. So for example, one particular design, fairly shallow topsoil, after year one, the roots have not quite reached the tailings, but by year 10 they are, which means the nasties down in the tailings are being mobilized and are showing up above ground in plant tissue. Question then becomes, what do you do about it? Big Bend National Park, we were brought in to look at how to control erosion in some areas with a cover design. But the problem we ran into there was, we're talking Chihuahua Desert, there's not enough moisture to properly establish a cover and keep it established. So what other techniques would you have to do to keep that land under control? Here's an example from a mine in Arizona looking at the effect on erosion from a low intensity storm event versus a high intensity. So the low intensity is 2.6 inches over a 24-hour period, as opposed to that same 2.64 inches in an hour. And you can see the obvious rills and gullies beginning to form just off that one event. We've used EDYS to look at the control of invasive species. Rocky Mountain National Park had a couple of plant species, leafy spurge and Canada thistle, which are invasive. And we used a model to look at different alternatives they could use for control, from spraying to hand removal to road closure to any combination of those. We gave that to the Park Service, and then they threw some of those numbers into an economics model that they had to get an idea on what would be the most cost-effective approach for them to control those two invasive species. They ended up deciding on one round of hand removal and then road closure, and then let nature take its course. Let's see, we're running out of time. I don't think I'll go through. I do want to end up here with an application we did in Australia. In the 90s, the military, the Australian government realized that most of their military bases were along the southern coast, and that unless they were really going to be invaded by penguins, they needed to do something. So they started establishing more bases in the north, but they needed a tool to look at military training impacts. And they ended up coming to us. But they said specifically, they didn't think that a tool that was developed for grasslands in North America would work in those eucalyptus savannas. But they were willing to try. And here's what came out of their report. EDYS was capable of simulating basic ecosystem dynamics in these savanna ecosystems. Would run for 50 years. The model realistically simulated the interannual variability in the tree, shrub, and herbaceous layers. The model was able to simulate increases in exotic plants and increases in native shrubs in the absence of fire. So in other words, they concluded it did indeed work. And with that, I'll take any other questions you might have.
Well, thank you very much. It was excellent. Just maybe one last question. I mean, you've been applying, you get in all these places. Is the model typically you will consult with other companies, or is this a downloadable tool that anybody can use for their own analysis?
Unfortunately, it is not a downloadable tool. The problem is obtaining the full suite of plant parameters for realistic simulations takes experience.
Mm.
And so if you wanted to use it, you'd have to come to me.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that makes sense. All right, cool. Yeah, then thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, you too.